Two more things that happened during this week about the Democratic Party. One is they got a leader, a new leader. The DNC has a new leader that nobody,
Mm.
I'm not super impressed. But the whole thing was kind of like a shit show. I mean, they have the six candidates, and then none of them are that impressive. So I feel like
Yeah.
the Democratic Party right now doesn't have some heavy ways to
Yeah.
unify the party, put the party together. So that's one thing. The other thing is there was an interview by Sean Ryan. He was interviewing Lindsay Lee, who was the former Democratic Party's financial committee member. So she's very, young and active within the Democratic Party, raising money, etc. But then in the end, she left because there's so much corruption. I guess she saw
Mm.
herself, within the Democratic Party. But that interview was interesting. One thing she said, remember, I think you said that many times, is that if they want to get rid of Joe Biden, they should have done it earlier, like
Yeah.
a year before, right? When they
Mm.
first started. Well, it turns out what Lindsay's saying is that they had the polling even back then showing that Biden will
Mm.
have a tough time to beat Trump.
Mm.
Plus, he's deteriorating, state. So it's not like within the Democratic Party, people don't want to get rid of him. They did. But they also had polling within the primary. As long as Biden doesn't drop out, he beats everybody. So
Mm.
nobody could beat him within the party. You see, they were in a very tricky situation
Yeah.
unless he himself chose to leave. It
Mm.
is hard from the beginning to get rid of him. That seems like it was what happening. Now, what is your take on that?
Well, I mean, it is an enormous, how shall I put it? That's an enormous condemnation of the American political system. Everybody could see that this man, this president, is
Mhm.
completely incapable. He can't run. He's going to lose against Donald Trump. Where they're telling us all the time that if Donald Trump is elected, it's going to be the second coming of Hitler and all of that. But they can't get rid of him because he still retains support
Mhm.
through the primaries amidst the grassroots, even though, as we've seen in previous election cycles, the DNC largely controls the primaries. I mean, they
Mhm.
stopped Bernie Sanders. They
Yeah.
engineered in 2020. They engineered. I mean, I remember Barack Obama got on the phone and
Mhm.
made sure that it was Biden who sailed through all the
Yeah.
primaries. I mean, it shows that the political class in the United States has lost its way. I mean, then what ought to have happened in that kind of situation is that the Democratic Party, the leaders of the Democratic Party, should have told Democrats, people across the country, the president is not capable of running the country anymore. He's clearly unwell. It's time that he stepped down. It's
Mhm.
time that Kamala Harris took over and became president. And we need to have an open primary. And
Mhm.
if Biden himself resisted, which of course he would have done, then there are constitutional mechanisms to remove him. And
Mhm.
anyway, besides that, even if those don't work, which they probably would have done, there would still be ways to explain to the American people and to the Democratic Party's base that this is now a very, very serious problem. The reason they didn't do that, the reason they took the easy way out of just drifting along with
Mhm.
Joe Biden is the reason that we discussed at the beginning of the program. They are so absorbed in corruption now
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
taking that kind of political risk, and it would have been a risk, was something that they were not prepared to do because it would have cut against potentially their own private interests.
Mhm.
So the American political system has atrophied and stuck.
So, in other words, corruption is not just unfair and looking bad, making people not trusting the government. Corruption make a country stand still more, right? Because
Yeah,
any reform, any even slightest reform would make the ruling class very nervous because they're afraid that their own corruption get exposed, right? So,
correct. Absolutely. That's absolutely. By the way, again, I experienced this directly in Greece in the 1980s. The then Prime Minister of Greece, Andreas Papandreou, was, as everybody knew, I didn't know him myself personally, but my father was very close to him, as was my aunt. My aunt worked in his cabinet. They all knew that he was terminally ill and
Mm,
incapable of performing his functions. But every attempt to do anything about it ran into the opposition of the entire political class, not just the ruling party, but beyond it. Because, again, one thing they didn't want was an
mm,
open contest in which all kinds of other things would have come floating to the surface. So he clung on and remained prime minister. And when he left, the succession to him was engineered. And the result was that Greece drifted into the euro, which made the corruption in Greece even worse, by the way, because it meant that they could get cheap loans and all kinds of things. And that led Greece directly to the financial crisis of 2008, with all the consequences that everyone knows. It's a bitter story for me, but
mm.
I saw it play out closer.
Yeah, I remember Diane French died. She was
Yeah,
literally on her deathbed. They pulled her,
yeah,
into the Congress to vote for something. I was like,
yeah,
why don't they find somebody just to replace her? And
yeah,
after that vote, I think several days later, she died. I mean,
yeah,
that was that was pretty extraordinary. You're
yeah.
looking at her, she was dying.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes,
You know,
yes.
it was.
Well, when you have a very insecure political class, and I mean, a political class can be insecure for many reasons.
Mhm,
The one in the Soviet Union also became a gerontocracy
mhm,
and very reluctant to conduct any kind of changes until it was, I mean, until the situation had been brought to crisis. The Soviets had done things in the 1970s, everything would have been different. But they were beginning to fear that they were losing control of the population, and therefore they were worried and afraid to do anything. So everything became paralyzed, and everything became stuck, and the same old leaders continued to be there. And you had, Brezhnev, who was barely able to speak. If you see
mhm,
old films of him, it's very painful to watch now. And it's not that different in the US. Now, the Soviets were not corrupt in the same way. I mean,
uh-huh,
that is one thing I will say about them. I mean, there was corruption in the Soviet Union, but nothing like on the scale that we are seeing now. They were not corrupt in that kind of way, but they were sensing that as dynamism went out of the system, they were losing control. Uh,
mhm,
it is a sign of a strong system that they can dispose of a leader who isn't performing properly. The Soviets were able to do that in the early 60s with Khrushchev, who was becoming increasingly eccentric and bizarre. But 10 years later, they couldn't
mhm.
bring themselves to do it with Brezhnev. And we saw the results.
Okay. Um, about this phone call, I mean, it sounds to me like they have several phone calls or something. Trump said that he had a phone call with Putin, but Moscow neither, Kremlin, they neither confirmed nor denied it. What is your take on that? What's going
You
on
know,
there?
this is a very strange story, all I can say. First of all, I am not 100% certain that there's been any telephone call at all.
Uh,
What I have heard is that when Trump became president, he was expecting Putin to call him.
okay.
And he's becoming increasingly annoyed about the fact that Putin hasn't called him. Putin's position, by the way, and the Russian position, is that they're not going to call the Americans because, as far as they're concerned, the entire reason that there's a crisis in relations is because of things the Americans have done.
Mhm,
And therefore, it is for the Americans to take the initiative
mhm,
and to contact the Russians and to start putting things right. The Russians have said this publicly, by the way. This isn't me guessing. I mean, Lavrov has said it, Putin has said it, all of them have said it. But anyway, Putin didn't call Trump.
mhm,
Trump began to get annoyed about this because, of course, he doesn't want to be the first person to call Putin because that might be interpreted as weakness. So he's now pretending that there was a call
mhm,
in order to, to get round the fact that actually Putin hasn't called him. So it could be something like that. But maybe there has been a call. Maybe there's been more than one call. But what is quite clear is that over Ukraine, the Russians haven't moved an inch. And apparently the Americans have done what they always do. They've offered bribes and they've made threats. They say, if you capitulate over Ukraine, if you agree to a freeze, if you end the war now, we'll give you all sorts of juicy things. We'll give you your money back. The assets will be frozen. We'll let you supply gas to Europe again. We'll do all of these things. But if you don't, we will wage all-out economic war on you. We will seize all the ships with your oil and your gas. We will impose restrictions on every country in the world, including China, by the way, that dares to trade with you. And the Russians have said, not interested. I mean, that's they saw it as a bluff, and apparently they've called the bluff. And what Trump has told us about his interactions with Putin, or if there were no interactions with Putin, with the interactions with the Russians, is that the Russians are sticking firmly by their position.
Yeah, remember when he first got into office, he also made giving people the impression he had a phone call with Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
He didn't.
No.
Then later he said something like the communications between the two sides, something like that. So maybe his office had talked to somebody, in China, foreign office or something. But I don't think there was a direct phone call between the two of them. But he gave people the impression they did. I find that's very interesting.
It's very weird, but it's very like him. Last week, when he imposed the 10% tariffs on China, he said that he was going to speak to Xi Jinping soon. Yeah. And then the word was that Xi Jinping was going to call him yesterday, on Tuesday. And of course, the call never came. Exactly. So, because again, he doesn't want to take the initiative. He doesn't want to be seen as the person who picks up the telephone and asks to speak to Xi Jinping and who asks to speak to Putin. He expects them to come crawling on their hands and knees to him. And that's not going to happen. Just as the Russians were not intimidated by all of these threats, which they don't take seriously, because as Putin has said, if the Americans did something as crazy as that, it would have a massive blowback on themselves. The Chinese are not going to go running after Donald Trump just after he's imposed 10% tariffs on them. Again, it completely misreads the situation. It tells you an awful lot about the psychology of the man, but it also tells you that he still doesn't understand diplomacy very well.
Yeah, I remember last Wednesday we were talking, okay, there was supposed to be, the latest word was there was a phone call yesterday, Tuesday, yes. But even back then we were saying we will see, right? Just to see whether there is.
It hasn't happened.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, I think Trump can only blame not himself, not just himself, but the US government in general. Why would anybody want to talk to the US government right now? Because the US government will say one thing and do another, and then you have a new guy come into town and say this, and then that person will change his mind before you know anything, and then there's a new guy coming in town. I mean, you are working with a very unreliable government. So what's the point of talking even, right?
Well, absolutely. You are completely correct. China has been going out of its way to remind everybody in comment after comment, speech after speech, that they are a reliable, predictable partner. By the way, I don't know whether it's been picked up in China, but there was I think it was in Paris, there was a speech of a Chinese official. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, was there. And this official said essentially that China's a reliable, predictable partner. And Vance was so upset and angry that he stormed out of the room. So, I mean, but it's true. It is absolutely true. If you decide to call Xi Jinping, and you will have an intelligent conversation. By the way, when my father was alive, he met an African leader. I think it was the leader of Senegal. My father did meet people because he was well connected, and this person had met Xi Jinping, had a
Mhm.
meeting with Xi Jinping, and it was at some big conference or other. This is after Xi Jinping became president. And it was a brief discussion. It lasted about 20 minutes. And he said, I got more out of that discussion for my country than I got out of 3 months of talks with the Americans or the British or whoever. I mean, because I can talk to Xi Jinping, and I know that what is agreed will happen, and it won't be
Yeah.
rediscussed and renegotiated, and we won't have to go over it all over again. And then somebody comes along and says, well, actually, this isn't really going to work, so let's just talk
Mhm.
about it. And this is absolutely true. I've discussed this with the Russians previously. I said that where the Russians are concerned,
Mhm.
I've heard this. The Chinese are the most ferocious negotiators that the Russians have ever encountered. And the Russians pride themselves, by the way, on being extremely tough negotiators. But they
Mhm.
said that the Chinese are even tougher. It's every single letter in an agreement is
Mhm.
argued over. But once the agreement is done,
Mhm.
it is rock solid. You
Yeah.
can bank it. You
Mhm.
can't do that with the Americans.
Yeah.
So, absolutely, as you rightly said, given this history, why should anybody come crawling to the United States? Now, the Americans can't get their heads around this. I mean, they've been used for so long to being the number one player in the world that the idea that other countries don't want to talk to them is something that they just find incomprehensible.
Yeah.